Okay. Very good. So, you should have all... Has everybody got a midterm? It's pretty self-explanatory. You've got 2 weeks to think about this. And we have about 4 classes to go to complete Marx and Engels. Take careful note of all the instructions. They are written for a reason. Some of you may have had some agreement with one or other of your GSIs about submission, electronic submissions, and your GSI will give you details of that. I, as ever, encourage you to work together in groups, but we require that you write your own papers. What else should I say? They're pretty interesting questions. The first one is to be constructed as a debate. So if you're interested in how debates are constructed, you might want to listen or watch tonight. The second one is all about the crises of capitalism within which we are dwelling at the moment. And the third one is where we're going. So it really is pretty relevant to your lives. Right. Have I got anything else to say about this? Any questions about these so far? Oh, one very important point. Yes. Do not seek answers to these questions from your generous, devoted GSIs. They have been instructed to be mum about these matters. Okay, yes. Right. Let's seek answers from your fellow participants in sections. Okay. All right. Going. Any questions? Good. Right. Well, as you see, as we proceed through the writings and theory of Marx and Engels, so capitalism seems to be into gathering momentum and heading towards what, Jason?
I really don't know.
See, that's a very interesting answer. Really don't know. Katie? Communism. Well, maybe not. But it seems to be heading towards at least some sort of crisis. Cumulative crisis. And actually quite interesting, the period of depression, which begins in 1929, sort of took some time to sort of gather momentum and to enter into the lives of the mass of the population in the United States through a massive, what Marx and Engels call disaccumulation, a massive disinvestment, a massive crisis that brought down many factories, many businesses, and many people lost their jobs. It's an interesting question whether we are in for a similar time ahead. What is interesting in this context, which is parallel to 1929, is that this is a world crisis. And of course, banks and economies are now failing, or banks are failing across the globe. Norway apparently has not hit the news yet. They are sitting on not just money, but oil. Yes. I've not heard anything about Norway. Norwegian banks. Going well, yeah, you see, social democracy. Right. Yes. Well, we'll talk about that. But anyway, it's interesting, and the response around the world in the 1930s was very different. But what all countries shared was a national protectionist policy. Basically, countries began to seal themselves off from international economic relations. And we got the erection of political regimes like fascism, Stalinism on the one side, and social democracy and the New Deal regime in this country. So we may be in for a period of renationalization. For all the talk of globalization, we may indeed, one of the reactions and responses to a crisis of this proportions may be renationalization. Well, we will have other things to say about this as we go along with Marx and Engels, believe me. And I'm going to try and show you the ways in which that Marx and Engels writings are of relevance today. But, as ever, we have to slowly build up the theory of Marx and Engels, and we've been making good progress. We moved into wage, labour and capital last time, and I'll summarise that in a minute. What we are going to do this week, today and on Thursday, is really understand the dynamics of capitalism as a system of production, as a mode of production. And I'm not sure how far we're going to get into those 7 points. Probably, if we're lucky, we'll get to point number 4. Perhaps, you never know if we get to point number 5 today. But certainly we'll finish it off on Thursday, and next week we'll read the Communist Manifesto, which is all about what history is the history of class struggle, and we'll see how the history of class struggle coincides with the dynamics of capitalism. And finally, next Thursday, week on Thursday, we will read with great care the final summary statement of Marx himself, his own summary statement, his own understanding of what his theory amounted to. And we'll examine that in detail a week on Thursday, and we will be done with Marx. But we will be ransacking Marx for the rest of the semester. Okay. Right. Summary. Well, I'm going to draw a big picture here. I'm going to go... Alright, I'll go horizontal. And they're going to be, in that case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. 6 columns. I'm going to compare feudalism and capitalism, so that you can not misunderstand the difference. This is the feudal mode of production and the capitalist mode of production. The first column is going to be the sources of subsistence. The sources of subsistence for direct producers. Sources of subsistence. And what are the sources of subsistence in the feudalism? Direct production on the land held at the will of the Lord. The land held by serfs at the will of the Lord. Direct production. They produce their own means of subsistence on their, you might call these strips, as they were called in the feudal era, at least in England they were. And the capitalism, what is their source of subsistence? Well, no longer do workers have access to plots of land, at least for the most part. They sell, it's a sale of labor power, that's the capacity to work, a commodity for a wage. Sale of labor power for a wage, sale of labor power to some capitalist who buys that labor power. What then is the form of surplus? Form of surplus under feudalism. Well, we call it rent surplus. Rent. And that rent can take the form of money, kind, that's crops. And for us, we use the prototype for the model of feudalism, labor. Labor that is expended on the Lord's land, on the Lord's domain, as it is called, by the serfs. The serfs are able to hold land of their own where they produce their subsistence, only if they render rent to the Lord. Now, here the surplus is, as I said, separated. Surplus and necessary labor are separation in space and time of surplus and necessary labor. Surplus and necessary labor. So the picture is, as you remember, necessary labor, surplus labor. Alright, so what is the form of surplus under capitalism? Well, here it's more complicated. Well, and it's a bit more difficult to grasp. But you can see why the comparison with feudalism is important. We're trying to figure out what's the necessary and surplus labor under capitalism. Marx says that surplus, a form of surplus is labor time extended beyond the labor value of the wage. Labor expended beyond the value of the wage. Labor expended beyond value of wage. Right? And so here, what happens is that the working day is divided into necessary labor and surplus labor. The wage corresponds to the necessary labor, and this is the surplus value. But we don't see the divide. Here, the separation, there is no separation. There is a fusion of surplus and necessary labor. They're invisible. The distinction is invisible. We think we are paid for the entire 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours of our labor. But in practice, we're paid, Marx and Engels say, a proportion of those 8 hours corresponding to the wage, and the rest of the day goes to the capitalist in surplus labor. But the whole point here is that this exploitation, the extraction of surplus labor, is invisible to both capitalists and, for the most part, workers. Yes. Right. So, how is the surplus realized? Realization of surplus. Well, under feudalism, it's directly appropriated by the Lord. Direct appropriation in form of labor, or the product of labor, or sometimes money, sometimes kind, i.e. rent. It's direct appropriation. Under capitalism, surplus is realized not directly, but where? In the market. When you sell your commodity, you sell your car, your shirt, you then receive an income, a revenue. And then you figure out ultimately whether you've made any profit. But you realize that surplus in the market. So, in market realization. Is anybody going to lend me some water? Thank you. Oh, the $4.6 billion industry. Very good, thank you. This is keeping capitalism alive. Thank you. So, under capitalism, profit Profit is realized in market. Profit is realized in the market. It appears as though profit comes from the market. And some people say profit comes from the market and is the reward for risk. The reward for risk. Marx and Engels insist that profit is realized in the market, but its source lies in the exploitation of labor. And that is, this is invisible. Yes, so all this is all about the relations of production, how surplus is appropriated. Now we move to the forces of production. Under jeepers, what's wrong with me? Under feudalism, we have the self-organization of work on the serfs' land, on the land held by serfs at the will of the Lord, serfs' land, and administered, regulated labour of fixed obligations on the Lord's land, and fixed labour obligations on Lord's land. Okay. Now, what happens? See, the forces of production is all about the capacity to transform nature, how we jointly produce things. So we first produce self-organized on their own land, and are directed and regulated in their labour on the Lord's land, where they have these fixed obligations. Now, for capitalism, we have is basically production takes place in one place only, in the place of production, in the factory, and there we have constantly what? Constantly changing production. Constantly changing production in the capitalist workplace. Yeah. Good. And finally, to ideology and politics. Because surplus is transparent under feudalism, it's visible, it has to be justified. So ideology and politics necessary to justify and extract surplus. You need some, what they call in sociology, you need to legitimate, you need to justify. Legitimation is important. Whereas Marx and Engels are arguing, because exploitation is invisible under capitalism, capitalism reproduces itself of itself. That is to say that, what did I put down here? Capitalism automatically, capitalism automatically, and we'll have to see really how automatic it really is, automatically reproduces itself through dull, as he calls it sometimes, economic compulsion. The fact is, the worker has to come to work every day in order to get a wage, in order for him and his family to survive. And it is that dull economic compulsion that keeps capitalism going. The worker comes to work, he or she produces the wage on the one side, and profit for the capitalist, or surplus for the capitalist on the other. Capitalism automatically reproduces itself through economic compulsion, or the capitalist relations of production reproduce themselves of themselves. And then the question is, therefore, what is the role of ideology in politics? And that is a very interesting question, which we will spend a lot of time studying in the remainder of this semester. But first, in moments of class struggle, when capitalism is threatened, we need to, so in moments, and ideology and politics are necessary for the regulation of struggle, one might say. And we will see that politics, the state, is also necessary for coordinating relations among capitalists. And when the state fails to regulate the relations among capitalists, be they industrial corporations or banks, then we are in for a time of trouble. So there is a coordinating function. But essentially, politics and ideology perform external function vis-à-vis relations of production. Whereas under feudalism, they are intimately implicated in the relations of production themselves. That is my summary. Questions? That took a long time, right, Christy?
I liked it.
You liked it? Ah, that's good. Trouble is you can't read it, but you heard me. What? Can I help you?
Yeah, I can. Under realization of surplus, after it says, and what's the last word?